I just want to pray for a minute before I start, because what I'm going to share with you is very, very hard to listen to. It's going to upset a lot of people, it's going to upset a lot of you, but we haven't got God's mercy at the end of it, and we haven't got a solution in Yeshua. Okay? There's a monument in the Jerusalem forest surrounded by 6 million trees that's called the Scroll of Fire, and it commemorates the 6 million plus Jewish people that were murdered during the Holocaust. And written on the bottom, it says, "My words are heavy and hard to bear." And the road to Auschwitz was paved by Christian theology, and we're going to look at some of that tonight. And so, Lord, give us grace to listen. Give us grace, Lord, to open our hearts. Give us grace, Lord, to be true to your word. In Yeshua's name. Amen.
Amen.
How many anti-Semitic people do you think there are in the world? Anybody offer me a suggestion? Well, a couple of thousand, million, maybe 2 million. What do you think?
Millions.
A million.
Well, actually, the Anti-Defamation League, which is the Jewish organisation that monitors these things worldwide, estimate there's well over 1 billion people hold hard anti-Semitic views. It is so illogical. It has to be spiritual, doesn't it? Anti-Semitism is the longest hatred. Goes right back to the beginning of time. And I think we can say it works like this in a sense. The missions of Christianity had said in effect, you have no right to live amongst us as Jews. The secular rulers that followed proclaimed, you've got no right to live amongst us. And the German Nazis at last decreed you've got no right to live at all. And that is really has been the history of Christian-Jewish relationships. But even before Christians appeared on the scene, Jews were held in bad regard and persecuted. But as my dear friend John pointed out right at the very beginning, this is a spiritual battle. It's a spiritual battle. It all goes against God. Anti-Semitism is anti-God. It's as easy as that. Yeah. The great theologian, the great theologians of the 20th century, Karl Barth, said this. He said the continued existence of the Jewish people, despite millennia of their attempted destruction, is the only concrete evidence of the existence of God. Because God kept his promises, despite the devil and man's best attempts to thwart them. Now, that's something to think about, isn't it? It really is. So where does this all start? Well, it really starts with the mocking of Sarah, doesn't it? When you think about it, as soon as you get into chapter 12 of Genesis, the problem starts. We move from the primeval histories into the history of the people. And we find out, don't we? We find out a very, very clear message coming through from Genesis. And that is through Yitzhak, yeah? Through the son of promise. He's going to be the son of promise that salvation eventually will come for the whole world through that line. And right from that day, there's been an attempt to destroy that. An attempt to get Sarah to such a state that she couldn't conceive, an attempt to supplant her with Hagar and Ishmael, these strange conflicts that went on and on and on. When we think about it, Egypt, things were going pretty well in Egypt. Then Israel ended up with slave labor, and what happens? Yeah, the death of the firstborn is decreed to try and destroy the race, isn't it? Yeah, no firstborn, no inheritance, no continuity. And so it goes on. But I haven't really got the time, which I'd like to, or I don't think you've had the time for me to run through 3,500 years of history with you, although it will be a pleasure to do so. But I'm going to be trying fairly quick on this. So we find that the Jewish people are taken out from land, they're exiled into Persia, for lack of a better expression, and into Babylon. And so we get these deportations that are going on. trying to take the people away from the land and break the continuity, because you've got to remember that Israel, the land, Israel, the people, and God are a three-stranded cord that cannot be broken. Yeah, bear that in mind. The three things are biblically inseparable. So when we get to the time that the Old Testament canon is finished, which is around about the year 400 before Yeshua, things start to change considerably in the fortunes of the Jewish people. They've gone back, they've got a temple built again, society's going on fine, and then Alexander the Great appears on the scene, takes Jerusalem without a fight, and begins this series of programs to do away with the Jewish identity. Now, Alexander died fairly early, and his two generals, Ptolemy and Seleucus, succeeded and split the empire between them. Eventually, the Seleucids were in charge of what we'll call Israel, for lack of a better expression, I suppose, at the moment. And something rather really dreadful happened here. Another attempt to completely obliterate the Jewish people. This particular ruler's name was Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Epiphanes, for you language fans know that means God made manifest. Alexander the Great proclaimed himself to be a god and a goddess, quite interestingly. But Seleucus also believed that he was divine, and he proscribed Judaism, forbade it, forbade Torah reading, forbade circumcision, banned the Hebrew language, but that's on speaking Greek. All the Jewish institutions were dismantled until the Maccabees appeared on the scene. Matthias and Modine refused to sacrifice the pagan gods, and that eventually ended up in the Maccabean revolt. So that brings us nicely to the time of Yeshua, when things have got to a pretty bad pass. The Romans are now in charge, and they're trying desperately to control these Jewish people who they personally believe are atheists, because the Jewish people wouldn't bow down and worship the Roman gods or worship the emperor, which is where the real big problem came and would continue to be so, because this, the Roman emperor was God, and the Jewish people wouldn't have it, which ended up with a riot and a civil war, which you all know, which brought the end of Judaism in its traditional form, and Jerusalem fell in year 70 of the Common Era, or AD, if you prefer. Now, what happened from here is really quite a painful story. Now, in the year 68, warned by a vision, the Christians left Jerusalem and went across the river to into what today be Jordan, I guess, and these places. And they came back afterwards, and there's been a continuous Jewish presence in the land ever since, particularly in fact in the north. But what happened was, eventually, as the Jewish people left after the second revolt in the first part of the 2nd century, we start to find Christian scholars. Right. So the first Christian scholar, or to use the proper title, apologist, is Justin Martyr, and his apology, which is still extant, is a dialogue between himself and a Jewish man named Trypho. So the work is known as Dialogue with Trypho the Jew. And it's at this juncture where we start to get the real bad stuff that's going on. Because very simply and very plainly, in chapter 16 of Dialogue with Trypho the Jew, he introduces replacement theology. Yeah, God has finished with the Jewish people. They killed Jesus. They're so bad, you know. They've now forfeited all the scriptures and all the prophecies. These now all belong to the church. The Jewish people reprobate with no future. Well, the Old Testament in the early church was put alongside Greek philosophy, particularly that of Plato and that of the Stoics, and this sort of hybrid Christianity sort of arose that was gradually more and more pulling Yeshua, Messiah, out of his Jewish context, out of his Jewish roots, and making him into somebody who sort of abandoned his people, which of course he didn't. It's ridiculous to say this, just as it's ridiculous to say that passage in Matthew's Gospel where Pilate, do the old hand washing thing, and got the people shouting for Barabbas, and you've also got this idea that the people caused a curse on the Jewish people for all time. Let's just look at the reality of this. That particular court where the people were in, you'd be really pushed if you could get 100 people in there. Really pushed if you get 100 people. 100 people can't call a curse down on the Jewish people for all time, can they? It's ridiculous. The whole idea is nonsense. And Pontius Pilate was a very bad man. He was called back to Rome on charge of malfeasance. And he wasn't really interested, but there's been a bit of a whitewash and apologetic for Pontius Pilate, or Pontius Pilatus, give him his proper name. And there was no curse on the Jewish people in perpetuity from that moment in time. But Justin certainly seemed to, he didn't seem to think, he actually said it right out loud and plain and in front of your nose, if you like. And his influence was enormous, absolutely enormous, Justin. And we find that this idea that the Jewish people killed Jesus, and they are so wicked, they've killed the vehicle of their own salvation, so they can't be trusted. They've got to be kept away. They're a danger to mankind and womankind and every other kind, and they're really bad. And we get to the stage, where we've got all the early church fathers, all these great big heroes. You've probably not heard of many of them, but people like Melito Sardis and people like Tertullian, and the list endless, all the early church fathers. If you read the writings of the first 200 years of the church, it's like reading a who's who of anti-Semites. Now, one of the most famous preachers was a man called John Chrysostom. He was the Bishop of Antioch, and he preached 10 sermons against the Jews. That's what they're called, 10 sermons against the Jews. And in the 10th one, he said, "My children, I have invested in you. Now pay me the interest by, basically destroying the Jewish people." So the great riots, people killed, property wrecked. Basil, I'm sure you've seen a church with Basil's name on it. Yeah, he used to encourage his people after the communion service in particular to go and wreck any Jewish property and so on. And he went on like this, and on and on and on and on. So we get to the time of the Crusades. Now, by the time of the Crusades, Jewish people refer to the Crusades as the first Holocaust, with good reason. Now, by the time we get to the First Crusade, 1095, there's a whole teaching that's developed about Jewish people that is held, by and large, across Christendom. And this is called the teaching of contempt. And the first thing is that the Jews killed Jesus. Yeah, and they will forever have a collective responsibility for what they've done. And they are to be ostracized and feared because of the things that they do. So the first one is that on Passover every year, the Jews kidnap a child. There's various variants on this one. There's usually crucify him, castrate him, draw his blood off to make the matzah bread with for Passover. Now, we all know that sounds ridiculous, and it sounds ridiculous, but to the medieval mind, it didn't. We live in the 21st century, we think different. Yeah, but it might surprise you to know that charge against Jewish people, when you think last time that was thrown out, I'll tell you, this morning. Yeah, people believe this to this day. And many, many thousands of Jewish people were put to death on this charge. The first time we hear about it is the reign of Constantine, 327-ish, roundabout then. But by the time we got the Crusades and into the 12th century, this thing found a new life in England, of all places. And the first case of this is a boy called William of Norwich, followed by Hugh of Lincoln. And then it sort of spread right across Europe. Tens of thousands of Jewish people put to death on this charge. Yeah, that's called blood libel. The second one is what's called desecration of the host. Jewish people steal the communion wafers. Now let's bear in mind, there's only Catholic theology, Church of Rome theology at this time, and they actually believe that when the priest rang the bell, that communion wafer actually became the real physical body of Jesus, and the wine became the real physical blood. So there's all these stories about Jewish people steal the host, stab it, urinate on it, defecate on it, spit at it, and generally then they finish by stabbing it with a knife. There's all kinds of fantastic stories in the annals of church history about how a baby appears out of it bleeding to death, and butterflies appear out of the communion wafer, and thousands and thousands of Jewish people put to death on this charge. Hard to believe, isn't it? During the crusade was called supposedly to clear the pilgrim routes for pilgrims going to Jerusalem and take back the Church's Holy Sepulchre from the Seljuk Turks. 1095 was the first crusade, and the Crusaders very happily murdered their way right along the Rhine, right along the Danube. St. Bernard, who I'm sure you've heard of, Bernard de Clairvaux, encouraged the Crusaders to take vengeance on the Jewish people, saying, well, when you go to Holy Land, remember there's an enemy that's far worse, than the Muslim, if you like, living in the midst of you. So Count Emich of Leiningen, who was the leader of the crusade, they butchered every Jewish community right down the Rhine, right along the Danube. When they got the Holy Land, the Jewish people rounded up and put in the Great Synagogue. The doors and the windows were boarded up, and it was set on fire, and all inside perished in the flames. Count Ramon d'Aguirre, who was one of the official historians of the crusade, described it like this: it was a glorious day. We rode round the infidels' temple, that's the synagogue, yeah, our horses up their knees in blood. And as the infidels died in the flames, we sang, Christ we adore thee. That was the first crusade. That was followed shortly by the Lateran Council. The Lateran Council in 1215 declared people had to be identified by what they wore. So this is when the clergy started to dress in a particular manner. And there was also various other things. And this is actually where the yellow star came from. And that was introduced in Germany. In England, this is called the Distinctive Clothing Act. You've got to identify yourself as a Jew because you're dangerous. Yeah, to be avoided, kept away from. And in England, it was 2 tablets of law on the outer garment. In Poland, it was a green pointy hat. Italy was a red and white disc. But in Germany, it was a yellow star. That's ironic, isn't it? 1280, all of Europe had done that, by this time, and the Jewish people were in a bad way because, as a Jewish person, you couldn't work in the normal sort of what we call normal occupations. You certainly couldn't be an artisan because you had to swear loyalty to the patron saint of the guild. So you're excluded, aren't you? Yeah, excluded from all artisan trades, excluded from agriculture, and you could only work in things that were considered not right and proper things for Christians to do, which is peculiar, really. So the Jewish people ended up very much as the money people. Now, there were no Jews in England before William the Conqueror. When I say none, there may have been the 2 came over with the Romans, but there was certainly no Jewish settlement in England before this. And so, apart from a small amount of goldsmithing, Jewish people generally worked in money lending, pawnbroking, jobs that were considered to be too dirty to be performed outside of the town and the city, and selling alcohol, because that was not considered to be a decent Christian sort of thing to do. So the Jews were accused of sucking the lifeblood out of the people where they lived because of this money lending, which included the king and all nobles. If any of you been to York, you'll see Clifford's Tower, which is like a little remnant of a castle on the hill, where Richard Malabase and his cohort killed all the Jewish people there, just simply to wipe his debt off. Jewish people were the property of the king, and when a Jewish man died, all his property, his estate, went to the crown. In 1280, a law was passed that then prevented Jewish people from lending money because it was drawing the lifeblood out of the king. The reason was they taken all the money off them for the Crusades, the Jewish people, and there's hardly anything left. So then, in the next couple of years, there was a purge, and 300 Jews were hung at the Tower of London on the charge of blasphemy, because money lending is an offence to the cross, hence it's blasphemy, hence so on. In 1290, when the Jews had got no money left, then they were all deported from England and didn't come back until Oliver Cromwell, although there were a few unofficial ones around at the time. Getting back to the teaching of contempt, it was believed that Jewish people keep statues of Jesus in the synagogue that they smear with feces, urinate on, hit with sticks and things like that, and curse Jesus. There's never been any evidence of this, just by the way, but in Rome, in the 15th, 16th century, there was a big tower, and St. John's Lateran got hit by lightning, and the senior clergy informed the leadership, if you like, that the Jews were doing this in the synagogue in Rome, so all the Jews were rounded up and put to death, and the storm stopped. Conveniently, after several hours. So this is the way Jewish people regard. But one of the things that caused more Jewish death than anything else was a conspiracy theory that ran right from the Black Death. Now, Black Death was in England from 1134 for 200 years. And the population of England went down from 5 million to just under 2 million. And this obviously was replicated all over Europe. But the theory was that the Jews were poisoning wells. Tens of thousands of Jewish people were executed, murdered in riots, or rounded up and executed on this charge of well poisoning. So this was how the Jewish people regarded right up until the Reformation. These things persisted, and it also was believed that Jews were in league with the devil, and it was also believed they had a particular smell, even had a name, Oda Judaicus. And it was believed that Jews had got pincer feet and tails, and the old vampire legends were very often placed on the Jewish people in Central Europe. Things didn't really progress much better from there. And then, of course, becomes the Reformation, and I don't think I really need to talk about Martin Luther, do I? He believed that all the Jews should immediately come to Christ because the Babylonian exile, the church had finished. And when they didn't, it just went absolutely berserk, if you want. And he had the Jews expelled from Germany, well, Saxony to start with. And if any of you have read my book on Martin Luther, you'll see it put in there very clearly, isn't it? Martin Luther said, we are at fault for not destroying them, for not killing them. So that's the Reformation. So we move on from there quickly to what's called the Enlightenment, where there's a big move away from organised religion and particularly away from the church. People thought too educated for this kind of thing, and ended up into sort of a new neo-paganism or humanism. You see, we get to what John was saying earlier about now, the church has done it, but now we'll do it as non-churchy people. We'll, do this. And this launched what I've called it the search for the new Adam. So this is where pseudoscience comes in, and they start measuring Jews' heads and feet and all kinds of things to try and illustrate that they weren't really human. There's something a bit different, and that the whole race had been polluted, and the real proper people, the real religion, were Aryans who came from India, really. But this was a theory. And this was very popular, these ideas, including some great philosophers like Voltaire, who said they were the sort of the most sort of abominable people that ever walked on God's earth. But the philosophers, all the humanist movements, you know, and the philosophy movements in the 18th, 19th centuries were all pushing this way. Russia and the Romanovs intensely persecuted the Jews. And one of the cruel things that they did was they took children aged 8 and 9 to train as soldiers in Siberia, and they marched them from wherever they were. Tens of thousands of Jewish children died of you know, the cold weather and starvation through Russia. And that was all done in the name of the Orthodox Church as well. You know, this pathway has been laid down so hard and firm by the early church fathers, by the reformers, by the Orthodox. You know, the Jews are evil. You've got no right to live amongst us and be different. You've no right to live amongst us. You've got no right to live. And it's a dynamic spiritual force that's still here to this day. The Holocaust could not have happened without the general imagination believing that the Jews were intrinsically evil. Anti-Semitism in its modern form didn't actually arrive in Germany, it arrived in France. Arthur Gobineau, I can give you lists of names, it probably won't mean too much. But Wilhelm Marr was a German, but France and Germany weren't France and Germany as we understand them today. You've got to remember that as well, in the historical process. But I mean, they had a whole science, this whole science, you know, that undermined the Jews as human beings. You've heard that expression, I don't know what he is, but he's still not a human being. Hitler said that. I know what Jews are, but not human beings. But when you think that probably the most civilized society in the world in the early 20th century was in Germany, and when you think how rapidly this fanatical Nazism took over, Hitler wasn't in power until 1931. Let me say it again, 1931. Yeah, by 1935, there's a whole eugenics program on. People who are mentally subnormal or other people who want it out of the way. You know, it's a nice big show trial. It's a human kindness, you know, to do away with crippled children, all this sort of business. And you start getting this sign, life not worthy of life. Yeah, life not worthy of life. These are, and listen to language, yeah? Lice, rats, bloodsuckers, parasites, yeah? You all get this in, and it affects the national psyche, and how a whole nation can turn in 5 to 6 years is amazing. Unprecedented in history. The whole society could turn like that so quickly. It's interesting, actually. 2 things that I thought about today is this. I sent a little newsletter out, I think some of you might have read, about Adolf Eichmann, and it was the anniversary of his trial. I'd also quite sort of escaped my attention, if you like, that it was the anniversary of the Wannsee Conference in 1941, just before Christmas, when the final solution was actually put into operation fully, which of course Eichmann was part of. After the war, the Jewish people were still murdered. There was a terrible case in Kielce in Poland in 1946. A lot of Jewish people were liberated by the Russians, but they didn't go straight back home. They were in other camps for another year. Many of them dying as well from malnutrition and frostbite. And there's a big purge. Stalin was purging out as many Jews as he could, because you've got to remember he got rid of Lev Kamenev, Trotsky, and Zinoviev, the sort of main founders of Politburo after the first revolution. And so Hitler finishes with the Jews and Stalin starts with them. And in 1952-53, there's the infamous doctors' trial, where all the leading doctors were rounded up, Jewish doctors, on a charge of trying to poison the Politburo. In Kielce in 46, 40 Jewish people went back and were all beaten to death as soon as they arrived, because the Poles had taken over all the property. I want you to think about this. The Holocaust didn't just kill this arbitrary figure of 6 million. That's only the recorded ones. It wouldn't include, like in the Ukraine, when UNSO, that were the fascists in the Ukraine, where they murdered tens of thousands of people and used to put big piles of bodies as the German army came as a present for them when they arrived. And of course, it was the Romanians who killed 64,000 Jews in Odessa, even though there were cohorts with the Nazis, but they're not generally included in there. So the figure's much, much higher. Then there's all those that died of the effects afterwards of mental illness, of the results of medical experiments that have been done on them and all this kind of thing. The Holocaust took a huge toll. Some of the great philosophers like Julian Emery, great writers like Primo Levi, committed suicide with the guilt of having survived. It's still killing people today. All over the world, anti-Semitism is still killing people today. So, I did say this wasn't going to be a pleasant topic to speak about, but it needs to be said because it's too easy to sanitize it all.
Mm.
It's too easy to sanitize it. I get very annoyed when I see films that they've used the Holocaust as a backdrop for a romantic film, for instance. I get very annoyed with that sort of thing. And I got very annoyed with the speaker this morning from the Holocaust Foundation, where, Holocaust Remembrance Day, we've got to remember the LGBTQ XYZ community, and we've got to remember, what was going on in this country, that country. The Holocaust was not genocide, it was ethnocide. They're only words, they've got two very different meanings. Genocide is the death of a particular group of people in a particular piece of geography. Ethnocide is where you kill everybody and you remove every trace of their existence. And that was what Hitler's plan was. No Jew was to be allowed to die in the bed. They're all to be executed. Yeah, all their books were going to be taken away, put into like a museum of religion, and so on. But there's been no trace of their community or anything left. That was the plan. Let me just wind up with this. You can't kill God, but you can try and remove the evidence. And that's what anti-Semitism attempts to do. It tries to remove the evidence of the existence of God and his promises through Yeshua, and his promises today through the power of the Holy Spirit. But in the church, there needs to be some heavy repentance for the way that the church has and still does treat Jewish people today. I mean, this BDS thing, the Methodists are the worst offenders at that, just by the way. I mean, it's a sinful thing. I mean, to boycott and divest and these kind of things, genocide. There's the Genocide Convention, if you like, defines two kinds of genocide. Active genocide, where you line people against the wall and shoot them. Then there's passive genocide, where you deprive people of the means of life and healthcare and so on. So what are you trying to do if you're trying to starve Israel out? Same spirit. No sense. I could talk about this for the next 10 hours and we'd hardly put a dent in it. But we really need to realise that anti-Semitism is alive and well and in the church to this day. In the Catholic Church in particular, obviously, but right across. I mean, I was preaching at a church in Spain, a Protestant one, and when I'd finished, three guys come out and wanted to beat living daylights out of me for talking about filthy Jews, So ask them what about that filthy Jew Jesus thing, It's illogical, but it's alive. So what do we do? Well, I know I'm speaking as the converted here, but we really need to pray that anti-Semitism will become apparent and abhorrent. Yeah? I want to pray that there won't be any more deaths, there won't be any of the usual. I mean, right now, we've got a real bad time on Ukraine for the very simple reason Jewish people have been blamed by the Russians for Russian people not being treated properly in the Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are blaming the Jews for helping the Russians, Caught between a rock and a hard place. So we really need to pray for liberating truth, and we need to remember that scripture, for Zion's sake, I will not remain silent. We need to do this. It's not just hobby horse and mine. I will never keep quiet about these things as long as I've got a breath, because it could happen again. So let me give you the words of the Baal Shem Tov, founder of Hasidism, and he said this: remembrance leads to salvation. forgetfulness leads to destruction. Or if you want Frederick Santayana's version of it, those who don't remember the past are condemned to relive it. So how can we bring some healing into this awful situation? Well, we can acknowledge, and I think this is a hard one for a lot of people, we have to acknowledge that the Holocaust is as much part of Christian history as it is of Jewish history, because Christians were the perpetrators. Adolf Hitler has never been excommunicated from the Catholic Church, neither has Heinrich Himmler. The Holocaust was carried out in the middle of Christian Europe by baptized Christians, and it's no use saying they weren't real ones. You can't write it off like that. It was a widely held and accepted view that the Jewish people were something less.
Please leave a short message.
And we've got a message to all the anti-Semites. Pack it in. Yeah, so we've got to acknowledge that this is part of our history. It's a shared history, and we've got to bring the corrections to it. You know, we've got to bring the corrections by sharing the gospel as it's written. And I know. I mean, I've talked to John about this a lot, and this is why I'm really looking at Genesis very hard. You know, in our group and everything, because we have to acknowledge our debt to the Jewish people. We have to acknowledge our debt to the Jewish Messiah. We have to acknowledge our debt to the Jewish writers, the Gospels. And the New Testament isn't anti-Semitic, but you can read it in an anti-Semitic manner. You with me? Maybe we'll talk about that some other time. Yeah. So we've got to read a Jewish Bible with Jewish eyes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we need to ask the Lord to open our heart to how we respond and how we behave. So what can you do for the Jewish people? What can we do in a practical way? Well, in my own life and experience, Jewish people aren't really interested in what you say. They're interested in who you are and what you do. Yeah. Franz Delitzsch, who was an Assyriologist and some very influential theologian in the last century, said, as far as the Jewish people go, yeah, we've broken the bones and then thrown rocks on them, if you like, tried to bury it out of the way. It really doesn't suit a lot of people to accept, you know, that we, owe our salvation to a Jewish Messiah who was brought with Jewish parents in a Jewish culture. And did he come to change anything? Did he say, I've come to fulfill Torah? Not do away with it? You know, I'm a living embodiment of this. Learn from me. I mean, as we've been looking at Genesis a lot, I'll join myself out anyway, over this last time, it becomes more and more and more clear that the scripture's just got one simple message, really, running right through it. You know, remembering God and his commandments brings salvation, forgetting them leads to destruction. So, what do? We acknowledge our history together. We acknowledge our faith together. And then we help with the Bible mandate to return the Jewish people to Israel. Isaiah 49:22, one amongst many. And then the other passage in Isaiah, and particularly ones that talk about where it says foreigners will rebuild your walls. Yeah. What does it mean? It means that all of us together should work together, you know, for the restoration of Israel, for the salvation of the Jewish people, because Paul did say to the Jew first, and then he also reminded us when you turn the page over that judgment goes to the Jewish person first. But we are not setting them a good example, have we? Historically. So I think I'll probably finish here, and I'll just say this. I thought it was rather interesting that this is only a couple of days away from when we held our Zoom remembrance thing for Ginny. And I recalled the first time I ever met Ginny, she came to a meeting that I was taking, and I did more or less this teaching then, 30 years ago. The problem's still there. So thanks for joining with me. I expect John probably want to turn the recording off, but if anybody's got any questions, I'll really attempt to answer them.